So in this step, we are dyeing the straps black. And I'd mentioned before that I don't like using the same Pro Water stain for the straps that I do for the armor. So I'm actually going to be dip dyeing this. If you don't do a lot of leatherworking, you are not going to want to dip dye. Well, dip dyeing, you have to prepare a relatively large dye bath in advance and have more than enough for doing your projects, and then store it afterwards, which is probably not going to be a setup that's worth making if you don't do this a lot. I do. So okay. So this is the setup I use for it. It's actually the Rubbermaid Brilliance branded Tupperwares because they are completely hermetically sealed. And the dye and also the alcohol you use to dilute it with are very volatile substances. This will stink up your house and you'll want to have some ventilation going. And they'll also evaporate. They'll evaporate right off and they'll turn into sludge. Even Tupperware that seems sealed, just the regular cheap kind you can buy, there's enough space around the edges that the alcohol fumes will escape. And this one is almost empty, which is why I pulled out the gallon of pure Angelus black. Oh, the best way to get these lids off, so as not to splatter generally, is to brace them against your hip, unsnap them, and then open from that side. Because if they get stuck and you try to like work it off, it'll go and get dye everywhere, possibly even further than what you've masked off with tape. So that is kind of sludgy in there on the bottom, and usually I would be diluting this with denatured alcohol, but I don't have any. I need to go to Home Depot and get some more. So I'm going to use isopropyl 91% rubbing alcohol. This works just fine as well. I think that denatured is slightly cheaper, which is why I usually use it, but this works just fine. And I haven't spent a lot of time experimenting to get the Angelus black perfectly balanced, because black is a very forgiving color of dye. If it's not black enough, you just do it again. But if the dye you're using is too dark, or is too concentrated, it'll leave a lot of excess pigment on the surface of your project, which is fine. You just buff that off afterwards with a piece of sheepskin, which you can tell this one's really grungy because it's been used to mask to buff off a lot of black. But that will take the excess pigment off and it'll be perfectly fine. But it is also a waste of dye. Your dye will go further if you dilute it. And this is too diluted right now. Like, it looks black with the camera on it, but if you tried to actually paint something with it, it would probably come off too light. Yeah. Even while that's still fully dark, you can see a little bit of the brown color of the leather coming through. But yeah, black dye, you often can't tell whether it's dark enough until it dries, because I put it on there and it looked black, and then as soon as it started to soak in and dry out a bit, you realize that it's not. It's not dark enough. It's got, I can't tell if you can see that or if it's just looking like reflection, but there's a little bit there that is still way too light, way too light. This is just a very dark alcohol right now. So I'm going to add some Angelus black to it. Basically, the most important thing about a dye bath is just making it deep enough that you can submerge the leather in it. And it's wrapped in this because alcohol-based dyes tend to escape around the seal of their tubs and jars and bottles and whatnot. It was wrapped up like this for the move. But even this thing, Rubbermaid swears up and down that it's 100% leak-proof. I wouldn't trust it with alcohol-based dyes. And oil-based dyes are even worse. Holy moly. Actually, I think I'm going to shake this a bit. Make sure that's on very smoothly. And this will be a little bit frothy when it comes out. That is just the nature of dye. When you shake it, it'll get frothy. When you're pouring, it often tends to do this. Make sure the bottom is over something that's not gonna, like, it's not over the carpet or something. Even though I have rug down here, rug that has had plastic sheeting stapled to the underside of it. So even if I was accidentally dripping a little bit off onto the carpet, I don't want to bank on that, but it's got carpet and then plastic sheeting to catch it. Okay, so I'm going to say that's probably enough. And yeah, you just dip it in like that and then wipe off the excess, or you can put it aside and let the excess dry. If it turns out it's not dark enough, if as I'm going along the straps start to dry out and it's clear that they're not, we can either make this a little bit more concentrated or we can just dip them in it again. So if you're doing a lot of dyeing, if you're dyeing a lot of things black, and obviously this is a super fast way to get stuff dyed, rather than having to take my brush and paint along all of it. But it's one of those things that's really only useful if you're doing it in bulk. Oh no. Happens. This also does tend to be one of the sloppier ways to dye stuff because it's hard to keep from getting drips and splatters when you are pulling stuff out of the dye bath. Be careful with that. It's going to be a little bit dull when it dries. The pigment in alcohol-based dye linger on the surface, and they do need to be buffed off a little bit. But a coat of some kind of sealant, a clear sealant, will really bring out the depth and the richness of the color, even if the color is black. So same is true what I said before about dyeing the armor, that you're introducing moisture into the leather again, and everything I said before about making sure it's in the correct shape to dry before you leave it and let it sit and finish drying is also true after you finish dyeing it. So don't, throw it in a wad where it's all crumpled up. Make sure it's laying flat. These things need to be flat. A brief note on the dilutants you use. I used to use acetone. Some people use acetone. I don't recommend it. Acetone is an incredibly caustic substance. It will damage the surface of your leather, and it will eat through your gloves. Your gloves will start to feel cold as they do this endothermic reaction with the acetone, and they will disintegrate, and you'll wind up with dye all over your hands. There are literally no gloves that will not dissolve, not react with acetone. There's none whatsoever. Butyl rubber, which is like the serious heavy duty, like I am a chemical worker who deals with chemical things, will give you the most working time, but it's a matter of how much time do you have to work with it before you need to get out of the acetone. So I switched to denatured alcohol, and that has worked much, much better. Or in this case, isopropyl alcohol. So, all right, so I think that's done. I'm going to put the lid back on it real quick, just so I can work on top of it. Finish rubbing this in. You'll also sometimes see an iridescent sheen on the surface of alcohol-dyed leather, particularly with black, red, and blue. This can be buffed off, and it will go away when you put a top coat over it. But it is really distracting because it's not the color you wanted at all. You're like, why is my thing gold? It's very gold looking. And let's see. I think that missed a spot. Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell in some places whether the light spots I'm seeing are that iridescent sheen that I talked about, or whether it's places that the leather didn't absorb alcohol. But I'm going to hit those. I'm not going to dip dye them again because the underside doesn't need it, but I'm going to splash some more dye across the bottom. Okay, but that one looks done because I did it twice through there. I don't need it absorbing more on the underside. I just need to get a couple spots on the top where it wasn't quite dark enough. Okay. And that is all my stripes. Depending on how they dry, I may decide that I want to hit them with a bit of gum trag on the underside of the leather to make it a little bit softer, because anybody who's wearing this, these straps are going to be going across their bare chest. So you really don't want the edges and the underside of these straps being all scratchy and uncomfortable.